Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of 2 Samuel. If you remember correctly, when we were last in 2 Samuel, we saw from King David and his son Absalom had rebelled against him, and he was trying to take his throne. But now Absalom has been killed, and in fact, well, I don't know that I would say murdered, but he has been killed by one of David's generals, even though he had told him explicitly not to kill his son Absalom. But Absalom has died, and David has, at least briefly, taken over his kingship again, unchallenged, except as we talked about in the tail end of the last video, there's now this group of people that we've got Israel and we've got Judah, as Israel feels kind of left out because David is of the tribe of Judah and he's gone back with them, and Judah has kind of made them their king. And so Israel, they feel left out, and this flares into a rebellion led by a guy named Sheba. The rebellion is crushed when Joab negotiates Sheba's execution in the northern town of Abel-Meth-Makkah. Joab is listed as commander over Israel's entire army, and he has always been loyal to David and always beyond his control. So Joab is loyal and he means well, but he doesn't always do what David tells him to do, and that is a problem, and it is going to be a problem really for Joab in the end. But anyway, what we see here is Joab has been told by David to go and squash this rebellion, essentially, because remember with Absalom's rebellion, David just kind of ran away because he cared about his son, he loved his son, and didn't want anything to happen to him. Sheba is not David's son, and he doesn't have that same luxury, and David tells Joab that we can't let this go on. So he sends him out after him, and Sheba runs and hides, and Joab actually negotiates with a woman and says, well, I'm going to destroy your city. And the woman's like, no, don't do that. What do you need? We'll give it to you. And he's like, give me the head of Sheba, and they toss it down, and then that rebellion has been completely squashed. So David, he's never checked Joab, even though all these things that he's done, all these murders of his rivals, including Absalom, as I said earlier, David's own son. But then Joab also knows how Uriah met his death. Remember that whole thing with Uriah the Hittite when David and Bathsheba was Uriah's wife. David sent him into battle essentially to die. Okay, Joab knew about all this, and so there's kind of an unspoken thing, like David's not going to do anything bad to Joab because Joab knows where David's skeletons are buried, if you know what I mean. So this is all happening, but in the end, David is going to pass this problem on to King Solomon, as we're going to read about next week when we open up 1 Kings. But anyway, after that, we have in 2 Samuel chapter 21, the people of Gibeon. So David accepts that long ago Saul wronged the Gibeonites. He hated them as foreigners and put some of them to death. God has sent drought as a result. Now David agrees to maybe we'll say reparations almost, that 7 members of Saul's family shall be sacrificed. This act of revenge is requested by the Gibeonites, not commanded by God. So pay attention to this. David is doing something here, even though he's a man after God's own heart. It doesn't say God condemns this, but God did not tell David to do this. The Gibeonites asked for it, and David has given them what they've asked for. And so these members of Saul's family have been put to death to kind of make amends for some wrongs that Saul had done. Again, this is not something God commanded, not even something that God said should be done, but it is something that David does for those people. And after that, we see some great deeds, some big things that have happened. And the names of some great heroes are recorded, especially those who mentioned in dispatches during skirmishes with the Philistines. David values the qualities and achievements of his warriors, some of them even giant killers like himself, as we read about here in this chapter. In Psalm 20 or in 2 Samuel 21, we are reading about these giants that have been killed, and these giants are actually descendants of Goliath, his own children, that not David has killed, but David's men has killed. And even we see in here that David is almost injured in battle, and he's saved by one of his mighty men, and this basically marks the end of David's career as a soldier, because the men are like, look, we can't have David getting hurt because of this, so David, you can't go to battle anymore. So after that, David sings a song of praise to the God who saves. God is a rock, a fortress, a shield, and a savior. David has found himself protected from so many enemies and rescued from so many dangerous situations. And we see this in 2 Samuel 22. This is a psalm of praise, a song of praise, really, to God. He concludes that the Lord is the living God with whom he has an ongoing relationship of honor and trust. The Lord lives. This psalm appears in a very similar version in Psalm 18 in the book of Psalms. Then in 2 Samuel 23, we see the last words of David. So David speaks of the privilege of being the Lord's anointed king. He has found the beauty of reigning with righteousness and in the fear of God. And now he is sure that his royal line will continue after him. And after that, we look at some of David's mighty warriors in verses 8 to 39. Some of David's mighty warriors are listed with brief descriptions of their exploits. 3 of them stole through the Philistine lines to get a drink of water for David from his favorite well at Bethlehem. Kebziel went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion, as we see in verse 20. But how interesting it is that we see listed last among the 30 none other than Uriah the Hittite and some of his exploits as a soldier. So he was a great soldier, a loyal soldier, and of course we know that his reward for that ended up being death, basically at the hands of David. And then in 2 Samuel 24, the last chapter of the book, David does something that he shouldn't do. For some reason, David decides to count his armed forces. This is an affront to God because it implies that David relies on his army for protection instead of on the living God. Really, he knows better, for he writes in a psalm, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And he wrote that in Psalm 20, verse 7. God punishes David's pride by sending a plague on Israel. The disease cuts down on a large part of the population and threatens Jerusalem. David is guided to buy a particular threshing floor, which belongs to Araunah, one of the conquered Jebusites. Here he builds an altar and offers sacrifices to halt the plague, and the danger is averted. Araunah's threshing floor is high up, overlooking the Kidron Valley, and it will one day become the site of Solomon's temple. So what we see here is David's vanity has kind of taken over here, and he is numbering his armies, not so that we can see what God has done, but so that David can show off what he's done. And so God says, I didn't tell you to do this, and now you're going to be punished because of it. And he gave David 3 options, as we see here in this chapter, of basically pick your poison, pick your punishment. And this is the punishment that David chose. The other punishments were going to be long lasting, and this plague was only to last 3 days. So this is the one that he chose, and it cost Israel thousands of men, as we read here in this chapter. And we know sin comes with a price, pride comes with a price, and the Bible tells us that pride comes before the fall. And this is one of the last things that David is recorded as doing here in this book. And it's kind of it's really important to finish well. And I don't know that we would really say that David finished particularly well because of this, because of the thousands of people that were killed because of this short-sighted decision that he made, really, to indulge himself in his own pride and ego. So that's all today for the book of 2 Samuel, and that's all for the book of 2 Samuel. We'll pick this up next week in 1 Kings. And until then, I will see you guys later.